So as you see, the Secretariat's been very busy with a number of the issues that we're going to be discussing in today's panel. It's a huge year for gender and development, a big year for a number of global UK priorities. Sam already referenced the G7, and that will be complemented by COP26 the UK is hosting. The UK will also play an active role in the Generation Equality Forum that will be marked this year, as well as the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. This is all in the context of the new Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, the merged DFID and Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and significant UK aid cuts that you'll all be familiar with. In that context, it's really important that we have a sense of how we can influence. Gender will be deeply affected, and so we're really pleased today to be joined by an excellent panel to cover some of the processes, the points of influence, the work that we're doing as the Gender and Development Network, and some of the opportunities for all of you to engage as well. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We're really fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Amira Sawaz from ActionAid, the Senior Climate Affairs Specialist. Then we're going to be also joined by Abigail Baldumas, Policy and Advocacy Manager on Aid Effectiveness at Bond UK, GADN's Director, Jessica Woodruff, and GADN's Policy Manager, Sophia Fangay. We've got a very tight agenda. We want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So if you could save that to the end, and then you can either type it in at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and we'll make sure we collect questions at the end of the session. I'm going to be very ruthless with timekeeping, and for all the panelists, I'm going to keep you to time. I'm just letting you know when you're at 7 minutes and you've just got 1 minute to go. I'll also hold up a yellow card, and then I'll be very strict about our 8-minute timing and hold up a red card. So you can keep an ear and an eye out for that. Be very grateful. So great, if we could begin then with Amira to discuss COP26. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet many of you that I haven't interacted with before. I'm just going to share my slides and hopefully you will be able to see them. Shouldn't start on that slide. All right, so I've been working with ActionAid on a secondment on climate and gender justice advocacy over the last year. Part of this has involved working with GADN members, three or four GADN members, including CARE, Oxfam, Plan International, and also some other wider organisations such as the Women's Environment Network, who focus a lot on environmental work in the UK setting. So we've been working together to initially think about what could be important asks on gender and climate towards COP26, and that's involved a lot. We've done quite a lot of advocacy, and we've had what could be considered, I think, about a couple of wins. So what I'll do is just sort of talk through the general COP space. I'll talk through what we've been doing, and then maybe kind of offer up a challenge or consideration for the rest of us who are thinking about how to engage with this over the next 6 to 12 months. So just starting with the basics, and for anyone who is fully aware of this, my apologies, definitely not intending to patronize anyone, but I'm just aware, having worked in this space for a long time, that it took me many years to actually really understand what was going on. So that would be a fairly normal baseline. So what is COP? It's the UN process. COP means Conference of the Parties, and parties mean states that have signed up to it. And currently, I think every country in the world except for Venezuela and Syria have signed up for obvious reasons. So it's going to take place between the 1st and the 12th of November, and this is a couple of weeks which involve lots of events, sort of external side events, but also heavy government negotiations. So currently the UK is the president and it's a negotiator. So this is a really important distinction that it has taken a while to be clearly communicated and for us all to understand. So you know, each year different party will host the COP, so it has a responsibility to set the stage and create the space for the negotiations. But of course, each country also has a negotiation position. And what's interesting about this year is that the UK's always negotiated as part of the EU bloc. Excuse me, sorry, my nose is just running, my apologies. So this is the first year the UK is actually going to be negotiating as a single country, which is partly why I think people are seeing this as a big opportunity, because, you know, in the context of Brexit and other changes, you know, the UK government is seeing this as a real opportunity to demonstrate its strength and, you know, political savviness, I suppose, and leadership. So what have they actually said about this process? Well, they're committed to working with all countries and joining forces, and they've really heavily talked about working with civil society. They've also said this will be the most inclusive and transparent COP ever, so we're holding them to account on that quite a lot. But also, just to flag, there's a COP on biodiversity as well, which is happening this year, which is also really important, which is related to climate, but obviously it's a different set of negotiations. So I think that's COP15 for biodiversity. So why can't I change the slide? Ah, here we go. So there are 5 priority areas. The ones in green are the ones that are probably more related to what we all work on or could work on. So adaptation and resilience, nature-based solutions, so working with nature to mitigate climate, you know, driving emissions, carbon and so on, but also to adapt states, a just energy transition, so transitioning towards the green energy, climate finance, so how do we finance these different elements to take place and who finances them and how much, and then finally clean road transport, which is more a UK commitment to change all of our transport to green transport by 2050. What I've pulled out here on this slide is how these key, you know, priority areas, and you'll note I've added one in there because these are very important for civil society, what is expected to be delivered this year. So you'll hear a lot of people saying, this year is a really important year, we've got a lot to deliver on COP, but often I don't think it's really clear what do we mean by that. So, okay, so the one area that I've added in is called loss and damage, and this is a really contentious area, but it's really relevant for us. So loss and damage is basically financing that will support countries in the aftermath of a disaster. What we're seeing is happening, as I'm sure many of you know, that when you have climate-related disasters in countries that are already facing a debt burden, they don't have space to finance and support social protection and response, so it's pushing them further into debt. I think Mozambique is the most recent kind of key example of that. But I'll share this slide separately just so everyone's aware of kind of some key things that have been committed to. And so loss and damage is kind of hidden, you know, in a lot of the official commentary, but it's a very important part of the negotiations, specifically that civil society are focusing on. And the COP unit itself has about, the last time I checked, about 160 staff, although it's changing all the time. There are lots of people with leadership titles, but it's still quite, it's an interesting, you know, it's an interesting space, I would say, from that regard. Lots of leadership titles. Really, the ones with the most power are the directors. But, you know, even then, it's a ministerial kind of, you know, it's at the ministerial level that the critical issues are really decided, I would say. There's also all of these titles, there's some for negotiations and for campaigns. So for example, you have climate finance, a director of climate finance negotiations or a head of, then you have the same for campaigns. And what they mean by campaigns is kind of setting the stage for, you know, the presidency side of things. And so there's a lot of confusion all the time. I think that the unit have tried their best to clarify that, but we're getting to a place where it's really clear now who you need to go to for what. So I'm just presenting this slide and some of the subsequent ones because right now there is another session going on with with the COP president, Alok Sharma, and what's called the Civil Society Advisory Council, and that's actually on gender and climate. So those of us who've been working in this sort of GADN working group on gender and climate have been working really closely with the key stakeholders in the COP26 unit responsible for gender and broader inclusion. And you know, they put it on the sort of a priority to sort of share with this Civil Society Council, and we sort of help them develop the slides. And my, you know, great colleagues Frankie Rhodes from CARE and Jennifer Larby from Christian Aid are sort of there now, sort of presenting these slides, but I just, because they cover the kind of basics, I thought I would share some.
Amira, we're just at 7 minutes now, sorry.
Okay, sorry, I've really overdoing. Okay, sure. So, okay, the main thing to talk about is the fact that there's something called a gender action plan. So this was agreed at the last COP, and this is an enhanced gender action plan. So there was initially a 5-year program on gender, a work program called the Lima Work Program. It wasn't implemented effectively. It didn't have clear measurables and indicators. And so there was an updated one agreed at COP25 last year. So there's no specific gender negotiations points this year. But what we do want to do, we want the government to platform the importance of this enhanced gender action plan, because states need to actually have political will and motivation to implement it. So this covers 5 priority areas, which are listed here. And sort of the critical challenge now, as I was saying, is kind of building political will. So a challenge to us all is to think about what steps can we take throughout this year to build political will, not only with the UK government, but with other parties, you know, in different countries. How can we sort of put pressure on those states to see this as important and to implement it? The UK said it's definitely, you know, really committed to implementing it, but they really need support, I think, from civil society pushing on those other parties to find this to be an important thing to do.
Last point, please.
Yes, so the key policy demands that are sort of circling at the moment are around loss and damage financing that I mentioned before. So one thing we're thinking about is how to bring a gender perspective into that so that it takes into account women and girls as a key kind of stakeholder. Adaptation financing, which is again another contentious issue, but women and girls are always made synonymous with adaptation, and there's a high-level female adaptation champion. So, you know, talking to her and trying to influence kind of what she's going to be doing around financing. Another area is around ring-fenced finance for women's rights organisations. So we've been sort of talking to the COP unit around, can you kind of make a high-level statement, or can you sort of start the process of mobilisation around conversations around what that might look like. Other areas of kind of asks are around, you know, basic minimum standards around having gender equality as principal markers in international climate finance. So there are lots of proposals circling, but what there really needs to be now is some kind of consensus among the women's movement, and also in partnership with the international women's movement. So there's a really important constituency called the Women and Gender constituency that are part of the process, and so we need to really be checking in with them, and this is something that we do all the time, to see how we can build consensus around 1 or 2 of these key policy demands. So I'll stop there, but always happy to chat to anyone if they want a bit more info.
Thank you so much, Mira. That's great to hear about those opportunities and the relevance of gender and the importance of that work. If we could move now then to discuss the FCDO and UK aid cuts, and then we're joined by Abigail Baldumas from Bond to cover that issue. Thank you, Abigail.
Thanks very much. And thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here at the GADN meeting, and I'm really excited to see many familiar faces. So a bit about me. So I'm Abigail Baldumas, and as was said in the introduction, I'm Bond's Aid Effectiveness Policy and Advocacy Manager, and I'm here to talk to you about what is happening with the move to 0.5, so commonly referred to as the aid cuts. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about what we do know about the aid landscape in 2021, and it isn't a lot. So what we know is that the current budget envelope that has been set in the spending review last year is 10 billion. This is a third less than the aid budget in 2019, and sort of significantly less than what it would have been, even accounting for the fall in GNI, but with the move from 0.7 to 0.5. So estimates ranging between 4 and 5 billion less than what we could have expected for this year. We know from the Foreign Secretary's speech in Parliament that the FCDO has outlined a new set of strategic priorities, the so-called strategic approach, that includes, that includes climate change and biodiversity, COVID-19 and global health, girls' education, science, research and technology, open societies and conflict resolution, trade and economic development, and humanitarian preparedness and response. Now, these 7 priorities are presented in lots of different ways. This is just one. I think for this meeting and in general, I think there are significant concerns about the move away from a strategic approach on gender equality and a very narrow focus on girls' education. We can also see here what we know about departmental budget allocations. And in fact, what we've seen with the merger of DFID and the FCDO is a re-centralization of aid into the FCDO. So the 81%, the biggest bulk of the budget is allocated to the FCDO. And in other correspondence, the FCDO is saying that they will have control either in allocation or in spending over 93% of the budget. So we're seeing some significant kind of re-centralization under the grounds of sort of the purpose of the merger having been to increase strategic coherence. Now, thinking about how that money is going to be spent, we have a little bit more information because we know certain things about existing commitments that can be estimated. So this slide presents a lot of data, but the top line takeaway is that once you start adding up the top 4 multilateral commitments that we know and various other kind of fixed commitments and climate, you are rapidly very close to 70% of the budget already being allocated. Which means, and some of that will of course be mapped against those strategic priorities, but in terms of what the new department and other government department, aid spending government departments will have to spend on these priorities, you're looking at a very limited envelope. For example, if you compare it to 2019, that envelope was 8 billion. This year, this year, it will be 3 billion. And that's even before you take into account all of the multilateral allocations, which again, in 2019, which is the last year that we have complete data for, was close to 5 billion. We have heard some rumors about geographic allocations, 50% to Africa, 30% to Asia, 20% everywhere else. These are all just based on kind of conversations. 50% to Africa is in line with the spending of 2019. 30% to Asia, if you include the Middle East there, it's a significant reduction. And actually 30% everywhere else, which is largely Latin America and Europe, is actually quite high. But not surprising, given that we know that one of the reasons for the merger is to pivot overseas development assistance into kind of other foreign policy priorities. So just a few words about the process. So it has been very opaque and there are no formal opportunities to engage. So certainly centrally, the FCDO is not discussing the aid cuts. They're specifically, officials we've been told have been instructed not to take any advice from anyone. And it's happening very, very quickly. So the Foreign Secretary has apparently given a hard deadline for the 31st of March for all the cuts to be finalized. So currently in the process, as far as we know, each department and country office are working on their business plans, which is why many of your agencies are likely to be having kind of preliminary conversations about what potential cuts could be made. According to officials, these are not decisions. These are preliminary conversations. But if last year tells us anything, it's that these preliminary conversations will very quickly be decisions. And given that the depth and the scale of the cuts, which is significantly more than the cuts that happened in 2020, there is not a lot of room for maneuver. The strategic priorities outlined earlier are being used as a guide. And there's also an expectation that centrally managed funds will be subject to kind of blanket cuts. certainly any new funding rounds have been paused, although with limited communication about that. One area that we've been told informally, or one, not area, but kind of lining, is that, you know, if you can make a strong case for how a good exit will actually save them money in the long term, or that there is a case to be made for good exit, the officials think that might be a case for finishing off programs rather than stopping them. So what is Bond doing about this? So first and foremost, you know, in the initial reaction, we spoke out very strongly against this. But then as the parliamentary kind of rebellion started to grow, and it is still growing and still growing strong, but we have to acknowledge that, you know, the moves to defeat any legislative change are a long shot, and also we're being given facts on the ground by the cuts process happening well in advance of that decision. But the Conservatives have a very strong majority, and the government can pretty much force this through. However, tactically, it was decided that the more that rebellion was left to be Conservative-led from a public affairs perspective, the better. So Bond and its members and the campaign have been supporting with evidence on about the scale of the cuts, the depth of the cuts, how it's very bad for lots of different reasons, and also trying to kind of engage constructively. There has also in recent weeks been a move towards greater public mobilization. Many of your organizations might be involved with that in key constituencies to build the rebellion.
Now, Abigail, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just we are increasing our media presence on this in the coming weeks. So in the past couple of weeks, we've been telling a story about transparency, the absence of transparency and consultation, both in terms of the 2020 aid cuts, but also what's happening right now. Issues around the legality of the cuts in the absence of new legislation. And we're currently doing a big piece of work looking at examples of cuts and what impact that's having on the ground. So telling that human face. We're doing a smaller amount of work to protect aid quality that's looking at kind of aid effectiveness in the 0.5 scenario. There isn't a lot of appetite among our members to do public work on this, but we are writing to ambassadors with some principles and priorities for good aid that we developed last year. And we are currently collecting and collating information from our members about cuts. And some of our members are exploring some legal options. This is the type of information we're looking to collate. So we're looking, and this is in service of the sector. So we are both looking to have this information so that we as a sector can have a picture in the absence of any transparency from the government. And where agencies are happy for it to be used in other ways, we would look to use it to amplify the case for aid and what good aid looks like, both in the media and with influentials like the MPs who are supporting the rebellion. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Deeply concerning about the opaque nature of those decisions. Thank you very much for summarising. So now we'll move to the issue of the G7 and W7. And Jess, if you could take us back.
Thank you, Daphne. So this feels like a whistle-stop tour of the massive opportunities and threats that we've got this year. And the next one is the G7. So as I guess you probably all know, the G7 is the group of 7 major industrialized countries: the US, Canada, Japan, France, Italy, Germany, and the UK. And this year, the UK is holding the presidency, which is why we've been working on it. Can we get the first slide? So the G7 summit is going to be in June in Cornwall. And the main G7 Leaders Summit has 4 priorities. First, around global recovery. Second, around promoting future prosperity by championing free and fair trade. The third one is tackling climate change and preserving the planet's biodiversity. And we know that the government is very much hoping to move sort of seamlessly from the G7 into COP. And then the fourth one is championing our shared values. And this is where the government is particularly talking about democracy and like-minded democracies, and has invited India, Australia and South Korea to join them. obviously with some concern about India being included in that. Can I get the next one? So there's also a foreign and development ministers ministerial track, and they also meet. The priorities have actually changed since I did the slide. That's how fast everything's moving. But essentially what we know so far is that, not surprisingly, the main commitments are likely to be around girls' education. There's going to be, I think, probably relatively interesting political language around SRHR, around VORG, and even potentially around supporting for women's rights organisations. But the issue here is whether there's going to be any actual financing. Not surprisingly, as always, it seems as though the announcements that are likely to be made on women's economic justice or the role of gender equality within the COVID economic recovery are going to be much less positive. And at the moment, it looks as though it'll just be about increasing private sector investment in gender equality. Can I get the next slide? So what the government has said is that they're going to mainstream gender throughout the G7. They've said that there's going to be a gender equality working group. And in fact, we now know that this is meeting tomorrow for the first time. And this is from civil servants and their peers across the G7 governments, but we're still trying to work out how that's actually going to work. We have been told that there's going to be a Gender Equality Advisory Council. And those of you who follow the G7 will know that that was the case for the last 2 G7s as well. But the membership still hasn't been announced. And really important decisions are being made within the G7 process already. So the fact that the Gender Equality Advisory Council has not yet even agreed its membership is obviously quite worrying. So then on to the next one. Chandra, yeah, thank you. So just in terms of what we're doing, so as Daphne mentioned, Gender and Development Network are co-chairing what's called the W7 along with GAPS. And basically there's a number of sevens which are CSO groups. So the C7 is the Citizen 7, the L7 is the Labour 7, the Gender Equality 7 sadly couldn't be called the G7, so it's called the W7. And this is the group of CSOs who are promoting gender equality and women's rights within the G7 process. And it's formally recognised by the government as an engagement group. And one of the things that happens every year with the W7 is that a summit is organised, and this year it's going to take place between the 21st and 22nd of April. But alongside that, and probably more importantly, is the advocacy work that we're trying to do with our international partners to influence the UK and other G7 governments. Chandra has set up a W7 page on the GAD website, and if you want to know more about that work, you can visit that website. The key policy positions, and they're changing every day, which is why I didn't do this as a slide, but I think there's three key things that we're trying to get across. The first is to move beyond education. That it does seem very likely that any financial commitments that come out of the G7 are going to be on education. And as with other areas this year, we're trying to get a balance between saying, yes, girls' education is very important, but it's not the only thing. It's not the only way to achieve gender equality. There's all these other things too. So that's the first one. The second one is trying to move some of the potentially interesting political language around VORG, around women's rights organisations, around SRHR, and turn it into financial commitments. The third one is that, as is so often the case, when it comes to women's economic justice and looking at economic policy, the UK government proposals are miles from where we think they need to be. At the moment, it looks as though literally the only way that they're going to engage with gender as part of the COVID economic recovery is to try to increase private sector investment, which we know simply doesn't work in terms of reaching the most marginalised women facing intersecting discriminations. And then the final area is around the area of democracy, where we're trying to get notions of anti-racism and decolonisation introduced into the discussion of democracy. This is probably a bit of a long shot, to be honest, but it's about trying to set the agenda for the future. And then just finally, on the last slide, the other people that we're working with is that there is something called the G7 Global Task Force. And this is a long-standing group of CSOs from all of the G7 countries who come together to share what they're proposing to each of their governments and try to get a kind of pincer movement. And there's a gender working group within that, which we are co-chairing with a US organization called ICRW. And if you want to find out more about that, you can do that through us. So that's everything. Thank you, Daphne.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jess. So as you can see, very fast moving agenda, a lot of information coming in. So thank you very much to GADN for keeping up to date with that and leading that process. So if I could now move to Sophie and ask you to summarise the CSW 65 and the Generation Equality Forum. Thanks, Sophie.
Great, thanks, Daphne. I hope you can all see my screen. So hi everyone, this is Sophie Fangay. Really nice to see so many of you on the call today. So with the CSW 65 and the Generation Equality Forum, because these are perhaps some of the two processes that many of us are already involved in to some extent or will be more familiar with, I guess I can take some liberties with not having to do some of the deep dives that the others have done. But certainly as it relates to the CSW, by way of a really quick introduction on it, it's obviously the largest policy making platform on gender equality globally. It happens every single year in March, and it's this annual global process where most of us who work on women's rights are engaged in. And this year it will be taking place between the 15th and the 26th of March. And many of you will have also seen, and of course it's a given, might I add, that because of COVID that it's going to be a virtual convening this year, which I'll come to in a minute about what some of the challenges that brings with it. But many of you will have also seen that the priority theme for this year is women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And I think it's really important to stress that everything that we've seen with the COVID pandemic has made this particular theme even more pertinent, especially as we see that women's decision-making abilities are being stripped away, and especially the question around violence, as well as a consequence of the lockdowns in particular, has been something that's been quite critical, that has almost emerged universally. And so it's something that's being really pushed at to make sure that there's strong policy commitments that come out of this year's CSW. And the review theme for this year is women's empowerment and the link to sustainable development. So just some logistics and background on CSW. I know that for most of you, if you are already planning to engage with the process this year, you've already signed up, you've already registered to attend. But just to let you know that they have extended the deadline to today. It had actually been 2 days ago, but they have extended it to today if you still do want to be involved in as part of CSW this year. So that's whether to the kind of civil society engagement side of things, but also, I mean, not that you will necessarily be able to gain access, but there are also other opportunities for civil society to engage with decision makers at CSW. So you will need to be registered to be able to take part in those things. So the registration link is through Indico, and you just need to be a part of an organization that is ECOSOC registered in order to attend. So if you haven't already done it, make sure that you do so by the end of today. The other thing that you will notice on there is that the Secretary General report, annual report is out already for the 65th session of CSW. And that particularly looks at some of the kind of big global trends, as well as looking at barriers and opportunities with regards to this year's theme, which is on effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence. And as I said before, those are key things that I think, as in relation to the pandemic, that you will see from the Secretary General's report that are really important, that they're trying to exemplify as part of the COVID pandemic, and making sure that those hard-won gains are not stripped back or rolled back as a consequence of what we're seeing with the pandemic. So let me move on to, no, I've got a little bit more to add on that. Just to say also that with parallel events and side events for CSW this year as well, all of them are virtual, and NGO CSW is convening all of those parallel events for CSW. There are hundreds of events that are on within the 2 weeks that are going to be on for CSW. So if you want to engage in that, if you want to listen in, there'll be lots of really interesting things to hear. If you haven't been zoomed out or sick of virtual convenings, you can register through NGO CSW, and you'll get access to all the various types of events that are taking place by civil society organizations. And for us as well, if you have an event that you're hosting that you'd like us to publicize with the rest of the GADN membership, let us know, and then we can put it up in the weekly notices so that others can attend. But the side events, the formal side events for governments hasn't yet been put up yet, but that's because, you know, it's trying to organize anything virtually is proving to be very, very difficult. So the draft agreed conclusions for this year, they're already out. There's a latest version has already been, I think it was 4 days ago that it was published. And again, it's really trying to make sure that the language on systemic issues is really clearly spelled out within this year's CSW's agreed conclusions, especially because of those two issues on women's decision-making, as well as issues around violence against women and girls. So at this time, we have not had any confirmation that the UK government is planning to host any side events at CSW. That's not to say that there aren't, but given the theme and as well as their involvement in the Action Coalition and co-leading the GBV one, it would seem pertinent, but we haven't heard. But if we do, we will let you know. And just some key things to bear in mind for CSW this year is that because it's going to be a really, really busy year for UN Women, who are one of the key leads for CSW, it's not going to be deprioritized, I would say, but it's going to be competing with the likes of the Generation Equality Forum that are taking place in France and in Mexico, or at least virtually. So it's something to bear in mind. The other thing to really stress is that Beijing +25, which was obviously going to be the centerpiece of last year's CSW and all the Generation Equality Forum stuff, that is not going to feature this year. It's just not going to be a redo of last year's CSW 64. So bear in mind that that ship has sailed as it relates to Beijing +25, apart from obviously what will be captured as part of the Generation Equality Forum, but not at CSW. And I think some of the key things that have been raised from civil society organizations, particularly Southern women's rights organizations, is this kind of digital divide that is going to result because of the convenings being virtual. And I know a lot of times we complain about getting visas for women from the Global South to attend this convening in New York every single year. But actually this new barrier, this new obstacle that's being presented is the fact that you need to be online, you need to register, you need to have continued access to the internet over the full space of the 2 weeks to be able to engage. But also it's the question on how do you even access decision makers? You can't just speak to them in a lobby or anything like that in order to try and do any of your influencing or lobbying. So this is going to be
now, please.
Okay,
Thank
sure.
you.
So just very quickly and finally, just to let you know about the Generation Equality Forum. So that already has been postponed to this year because of the pandemic. So that is kicking off with the convening in Mexico, which is on literally the eagle-hawked eyes again amongst you will notice that I think it's 3 days after the end of CSW. So it's back-to-back jam-packed. So if you're involved in CSW, it might be worth something your time getting involved in the first part of the Generation Equality Forum. And as many of you will know as well, the forum has been billed as this multi-stakeholder gathering centered around civil society, but also brings together a whole variety of other actors, including the private sector, member states, philanthropic organizations, and so on. And so really it's to kind of chart the path forward as looking at what has happened, what progress we've made as it relates to Beijing 25 years on, and then seeing what else needs to be done, because we're still miles off from reaching any of the targets that were outlined within the Beijing Declaration. So yes, we kick off in March in Mexico. Registration for that is also already open. So please, if you do want to get involved with that, I'll include all of this information in the weekly notices for everyone. Make sure you do register. There's different levels of participation for civil society, but you can get involved and see what's happening there. And it's only a 3-day process. Then obviously that will then lead on to the convenings in Paris in June. The dates are yet to be confirmed, but it's really to kind of culminate the kind of agreements or the ambitions that were set out in Mexico to make sure that they're concretized in Paris. And of course, just lastly to say on the action coalitions, which are really the centerpiece of the Generation Equality Forum, you've got those 6 different action coalitions. We've also, as GADN, put together a really short briefing that you can access online. I'm wrapping up, Daphne, 1 minute. And then you can find a lot of that information, that detail online. But just to say that you will notice that the UK government obviously is leading the GBV Action Coalition. They've already been selected to do that. But this is a really quick snapshot I'll share with you on my next slide of some of the different stakeholders that are involved with the Generation Equality Forum, with the action coalitions. And you can see at the moment it's wide ranging. You've got member states, civil society organizations, UN agencies, all the rest of it. And the idea is really starting from Mexico to pull together that blueprint of what actions need to be taken and developed in order to then achieve all of these particular goals for advancing gender equality by 2030 to coincide with the end of the Agenda 2030. So that's really it. I think I'll stop there now. But the key thing is to try and make sure, as you can see, all of these key global processes that are taking place back to back this year. I mean, it's pretty exhausting, but I think that there's a real need to make sure that we are aligning some of those key messages and priorities so that they don't look like they're competing amongst each other. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Daphne.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And yeah, really recommend that overview provided by GADN of the CSW Generation Equality Forum process that summarises some of those action coalitions. So thank you, Sophie. So we'll move now to Q&A. You're welcome to turn your cameras on, raise your hand. Chandra will collect the questions. If you'd rather type it into the chat, then Chandra will also be happy to read those out, and we'll take questions for the panel in groups. So anybody keen to begin? Great. We had a very comprehensive panel that answered all of your burning questions, I know, but I did want to give Amira a chance to just speak a little bit more about the gender focus of COP26 and the opportunities there, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry that it took me a while to get there. Okay, so I mentioned as I was talking, there's something called the Gender Action Plan, but this is an enhanced Gender Action Plan, which basically the first one failed. It failed because parties didn't really see it as important, and there weren't indicators, or there weren't clear expectations on what they should do. So although that's not a negotiating point of this conference, that motivation and political will thing is really important. But there's also a bit of an issue, which I've noticed being in the climate advocacy space. There's almost this expectation that the UK government can just make stuff happen. The UK government's the president, its role is to convene, motivate, and then it has its negotiating bit on the side, which is about the UK's interests. So what they really need is, they buy into the gender stuff, actually. They've made, gender a key priority. They've added, off the back of our advocacy, they've added a new finance in their public priorities for climate financing on gender responsive financing. But what they need is intel from us on what levers to pull, which parties, based on our networks. So that there's something that we need to do, I think, not just in the gender space, across the whole climate advocacy piece of civil society, which is to demonstrate our kind of reach in and the networks that we have, and to create spaces to leverage the voices of our colleagues in different countries, right? To kind of help build that momentum of the other negotiating parties, or at least put pressure on them to take it seriously. So that's one thing around the gap, the Gender Action Plan. The other thing, again, as I was saying, around financing, they want to do it, they don't know how. So what are we asking them to do? We've been coming up with different ideas, and these are all, importantly, we have to lean on what the women and gender constituency have been doing for decades, right? So, one of them is around, do they need some kind of minimum standards on gender responsive financing? Do they need, you know, one thing we've been talking to them about is, should they be ring fencing a proportion of international climate finance, which, as you noted from the other our other colleagues' presentation, that climate financing is really picking up pace. There's a huge amount in the next 5 years. But should we be expecting them to ring fence, to go to women-led and women's rights organisations if gender is actually a priority, you know, but they kind of need a bit of support. That, like, I've put that idea to them and they said, that sounds really interesting. Do you know any other states that would be into that? Like, how much consensus is there around this? The other thing that has come up is around, you know, much like a lot of the gender advocacy we do around financing, around, you know, gender equality as a principal marker on the ICF that they're spending, that the same question, to what extent, they'll ask us, to what extent do you think there are levers that we can pull where we can get other states to say that this is important? So we have to think strategically if we want to have an impact. We have to see it as a partnership, I think. I'm not saying that's giving government a kind of green card, you know, it's not about like making excuses for them, but it's about recognizing the challenges that they have. So I would say those are the two things. The women's leadership piece, they get it. They've made changes, you know, off the back of a campaign which was around them not having enough women in the COP unit itself at the leadership level. They have actually appointed female ministers and increased the amount of women in the unit. So they're kind of a bit over that, and so are the women and gender constituency themselves. They've said, look, it's a bit worrying if kind of UK-based NGOs that haven't been in this space before are suddenly coming up and saying women's leadership without actually offering something credible around the implementation piece. Women's leadership is really important, but so are all the other pieces that they've been advocating for so long. So those are the main bits, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions coming in. Sophie, I can see, has her hand raised, and there's a question in the chat as well. Should we take Sophie first and then hear from the chat?
This is perhaps, sorry, I feel like I'm taking up a lot of space here because I've already spoken. But this is perhaps also tied in with the question that's in the chat box. So maybe, Chandra, you can also read that one out. But it was for Amira on the loss and damage question. I just wanted to check. Is there any work that's being done from UK civil society groups to link that to questions around anti-racism or reparations or issues around that? And if so, is it feasible to even bring that to a UK government at this point, or have you seen any opportunity to do that?
So I can answer both questions together. So the question from Annaline, sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, is around, you know, what is loss and damage, right? So is it just in the aftermath of a rapid onset disaster, or is it to do with the slower onset? So, okay, loss and damage was part of the Paris Agreement. So you might often hear people saying the Paris Agreement was a big success. So there were different elements of success, one being that China and the US signed up to it, but another area of real success from a civil society perspective was an agreement that there would be a mechanism set up where rich countries that have obviously benefited from like mass industrialization and other, you know, other things, which we don't have time to go into now, you know, that we're, you know, the UK, for example, has the biggest historical responsibility for climate. So should it be supporting countries that it's ultimately, you know, used in the past to benefit from? Should it be supporting them with finance now, because they're, you know, not really causing the climate crisis, but they're dealing with the impacts? So I think historically loss and damage was seen about, you know, as a kind of rapid onset kind of humanitarian crisis, sudden disaster lens. But I think since the Paris Agreement, there have been discussions around it being, you know, like, being able to quantify slow onset disaster financial impacts is much more difficult. So if you have a huge, you know, like flood and loads of buildings fall down, it's much, and you can quantify the economic impact of that, that's one thing. But if you have like, you know, overlapping inequalities and governance issues, and then you have a drought which is going on for a period of time, and that leads to different losses, it's a bit more difficult to quantify. So I think there's more to be done around negotiation, around the language of what loss and damage actually is. So I'm sorry that isn't a really clear answer, but hopefully that's somewhat of an answer. It's in a progressive stage. What the UK civil society is doing, we do have some key organisations that have been critical to it actually, the whole loss and damage agenda. So Practical Action, I think Christian Aid have been key to it in the past, Oxfam. I'm sure many other organisations that I'm not, you know, I'm not mentioning there. What's happening right now is, so some of us, sort of aside from the gender work I'm doing, I sit on an advisory panel on loss and damage with the UK negotiations team. And there's a particular mechanism that needs to be in place by COP26. So this is why civil society is saying, like, you need to deal with this now. It needs to be dealt with by COP26 for loss and damage to work. And that's called the Santiago Network. So I could go on for hours about that, but there's literally nothing on paper. We were literally talking in the meeting about there's a blank piece of paper. So there's no plans currently in place for what that's going to look like to be able to actually deliver on any loss and damage. So that's step one, like before we even get to the conversation around reparations. But the issue of debt, and not the language of reparations, but the issue and the language of debt is coming up now. There's what's being called a climate and development ministerial that's happening at the end of this month. Some of you may have been invited to some of the kind of pre-workshops around that. And one of the topics that they put on the agenda was climate change and debt. And that's actually a huge step in the right direction, because until this year, no one was interested in, you know, states did not want to talk about that. So I think the UK government is trying to demonstrate some leadership in that area, but of course they're never going to use the language of reparations. Or maybe they will, I hope they will, but no.
Thanks so much. Chandra, any questions that are coming up or any hands that I'm missing?
I don't think so.
Do we have Natalie?
Oh yeah, Natalie Fisher right now.
Hi, where's my screen? Hi, thanks very much. This is my first meeting, being able to join with you, because I'm based over in Ottawa, Canada. So really appreciate all the presentations. And I just wanted to pick up, I think it was Jessica who was talking about the overall shift in aid and overall decline. Because I just wanted to mention, I'm doing some work right now with UNICEF. And there's a campaign that's being developed and is about to be launched, being driven by UNAIDS called Education Plus. And so it just struck me that what Jessica was saying about how there seems to be this narrowing of targeting gender equality into the girls' education envelope. So I just wanted to share that this campaign is going to be launched later in March. And it's a joint campaign with UNAIDS, UNESCO, UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, where they're really basically trying to pin gender equality on girls completing secondary education in sub-Saharan Africa, and how that can contribute particularly to a reduction of HIV prevalence among adolescent girls, which is, pretty much one of the highest groups. But they're calling it Education Plus, so they're linking not only the completion of secondary education, but also comprehensive sexuality education, SRHR, ending GBV, and school to work transitions and economic empowerment. But I think, obviously they've got to be careful not to be really just focusing on the education piece of it, that they really need to be uplifting the other plus elements. But I just wanted to raise that so that you're aware, and they're planning an event at CSW in March on the 17th, where they'll be launching it with several governments, as well as having adolescent girls and young women as part of that, as being, seen as being leaders in this effort. So just wanted to share that, and thanks so much for all the presentations.
Thank you, Natalie. We have Helen who would like to pose a question for Abby. So Helen, perhaps you can unmute yourself and address your question.
Lovely, thanks so much. Yeah, just thinking about the advocacy that you said Bond are doing on the cuts, about those kind of principles that you're sharing with ambassadors. To what extent are those principles thinking about the intersection of gender is one question, and just a reflection that, yeah, we're getting a sense that protection programming is under threat, but not protection programming in its entirety, but rather the FCDO is focusing on outputs, but not focusing on the kind of community engagement, the enabling environment, because it's always easier for donors to focus on things they can count. And so I wonder whether we can, as we draw together that information on the cuts, and various organizations are beginning to be able to share some information on what that looks like. We're thinking about at IRC how we can really try and hone down on what the disproportionate impact is on women and girls, where those enabling environments, community engagement, long-term prevention strategies are actually the ones being hardest hit. So good to hear from you, Abby, about whether you're seeing that and whether that is part of the advocacy on the principles. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. Great question. Certainly sort of intersectionality of gender and other ways in which people are marginalized feature strongly in the principles. Sort of the SDGs and leave no one behind are the lens through which we have approached those principles. I am actually more than happy to share them with this group, and in case your agencies might find them useful to amplify. But I think those bigger picture, those bigger questions about impact, we are only going to be able to answer in the future. We can't even say that about what has happened in 2020 because the government is still not being forthcoming with the full picture of the cuts that happened last year. So I think we have a long way to go before we're able to really understand the impact of these cuts on the lives of women and girls and their families and communities partly because of the lack of transparency. But I do think it's a real issue. I'm also hearing very similar things about protection programming across regions. It's one of the main areas that we're hearing is being cut in humanitarian programming. So I'm afraid, yes, I think it will eventually. I think what we're trying to do at Bond is figure out how we will engage the government on these questions of the impact of their programs when they simply don't want to talk about what they're doing. I think where we are seeing some more openness, particularly from the new division that will replace the Inclusive and Open Societies group, is greater willingness to be open on issues that aren't related to the cuts. So hopefully as the new department settles in, there will be space. And another kind of hopeful thing that we've heard from the Foreign Secretary is a real commitment to impact and kind of programmatic effectiveness. And so hopefully as they go through, as they move away from this kind of very fraught and secretive process, those conversations will reopen. And we will be able to, as a sector, rebuild those relationships with key interlocutors in the department. I don't think the space is there yet. And I think it's going to be a long time until we actually start to have the data about that. One thing, Bond is going to be convening in the next couple of weeks, a special session where we're going to host development initiatives to talk about the analysis they've been doing, both on the 2020 cuts, but also they're in the process of doing some work on the 2021 cuts. It's going to come out in the next week or so. And they had some reflections on the big picture impact on gender programming. But as ever, gender marker is not used, therefore data not there. Does that answer your question? And everyone, I will absolutely share my presentation. I tried to share it in the chat and it failed, but I will send it to Sophie, and I'm certainly more than happy for all of you to have a copy of it.
Many thanks, Abby. Chandra, any more coming in?
Yes, we have a question from Kate Horsteed. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. And this is for all speakers. So she says that it was great to briefly see on Amira's slides that those advocating are taking an intersectional rights-based approach. It would be good to hear more about how this is going for all speakers. How are we ensuring this happens across all the processes to ensure women in all of their diversity across the whole life course, including older age, are included?
Okay, thank you. I think we'll make that our last question and take that to the whole panel. And if there's any final points you just want to make as well, that you feel burning that you didn't have a chance to make, that would be great. And Kate, if you also want to chip in on that, glad to hear from you as well. So Jess, perhaps you could start.
Sure, okay. So on the G7, the way that we're doing it is working through a number of different organisations who are now going to be part of the W7, and we're trying to get as broad a range of women's rights organisations and feminists involved in the W7 as we can. I think specifically on issues related to older women, the issues around social protection and care work, which are probably some of the kind of key ones, are going to be exactly the ones that aren't being discussed at the G7 at the moment, and that the whole focus on private investment is very much not going to meet the needs of older women in return to women's economic justice. So I think that's a kind of key one within the W7 priorities. I'll pass over to Sophie.
I think Jess has certainly covered that, and I think for us a big thing has just been making sure that the G7 and the W7 convenings are not exclusively centered around G7 countries, that we're making sure that it is inclusive of Southern women's rights organizations, Southern feminists as well, who have a lot to say on the issues that are being covered, especially because we know that G7 policies will have a direct impact on them as much as they can be, collated here and developed here. Those are long-lasting, consequences as it relates to, COVID, economic recovery, responses on debt, etc. Those are all going to be long-lasting, have long-lasting impacts on women in the Global South. So I would say that is one of the ways in which we're trying to make sure that we have a more diverse intersectional spread of organizations and women represented at the session. But of course, I certainly take your point, Kate, on the need to look at other kind of axes of oppression as well, as opposed to not just looking at ethnicity or geographical location. But that's one of the steps that at least we're taking, and trying within that field to then look at the ways in which we can diversify the people that we include in the convening with the W7. I don't know if, and Amira, I don't know if you have something else to add on climate front.
I've said a lot already, but just to say, because there's so many different areas of the climate space. It's technical and policy, and there's a lot of politics and history. So just, yeah, happy to always have a chat if I can be helpful, because I recognize it's just not possible to do it in the scope of today, but yeah, just reach out to me.
Thanks very much.
I can come in briefly. I think specifically our work on the aid cuts, it has very much been focused on women as recipients and people as recipients of aid, a lot, making sure that those impacts are considered in the decisions being taken. But the work on the aid cuts is really only a narrow part of our work on the future of UK aid, which is linked in to work that Bond is doing on decolonizing aid and anti-racism. And I think taking an intersectional rights-based approach is going to be at the heart of those conversations going forward. And as I said, as we move away from this very narrow kind of defensive positioning where both the sector and the government are so defensive about what's happening, hopefully we will be able to create spaces that allow for those types of conversations to happen in a way that they simply aren't, on the issue of the aid cuts, aren't able to happen right now. I did want to say one more thing that, so I talked a little bit about the sectoral priorities of the government, but there are also some other changes that Rob has put forward, and in particular, a move to greater bilateral aid. I don't think we'll see it this year just because of the depth of the cuts that are happening, but the move to greater bilateral aid opens up opportunities for greater progress on localization and ensuring, and potentially for channeling more funding to local women's rights and women-led organizations. And I think that definitely needs to be part of our conversation about what the future of UK aid looks like. So I do think there is space there. Thank you.
Kate, anything to add?
Thank you. Kate, did you want to say something? Sorry, I think you wanted to come in. You're mute.
Yeah, I just realized that, sorry. Thanks very much for your responses. Yeah, I think my point was really that I think there's just a concern that as the space shrinks for civil society, there's a risk of us sort of, I think we can all do it sometimes, thinking of women as the people that reflect us, as the sort of policy people that are advocating. And then if you look around the room, the screen, about who's advocating, it could be quite a narrow focus, and it's kind of seeing all women and girls as active rights holders as well, and not just recipients. So, but yeah, thanks for your very comprehensive responses, and it's good to hear that we're still all advocating for that rights-based approach and thinking about intersectionality. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, important points, and absolutely, I'd like to really thank the panel for doing such a great and comprehensive job on a really busy agenda. It was really interesting to hear from all of you, and encouraging to hear from all of you on how you're working hard to meaningfully integrate women's rights and gender across all the areas of influence at the moment. It's clear that there are challenges ahead, not least, of course, the pandemic, but some of the issues on transparency and opaque processes that you discussed, of course, the cuts and some of the problematic framing from a gender perspective, but the opportunities that you highlighted around financing, around resourcing, and around potentially making space for our issues, including the decolonisation agenda, including localisation agenda, and certainly more space for women's rights organisations. It's great to see those shards of light on the horizon. So thank you very much. It's